As some of you may have guessed from the topics of my previous videos, side-decking theory is a pet topic of mine. Today I want to explore that topic in greater detail with the first episode of a new mini-series that I plan to call Technical Support, and in which I will take specific archetypes and discuss side deck theory for each of them in greater detail. These videos will be a hybrid of deck analysis and side-decking theory. Welcome back to Goat Duels. I'm InfusionsCap, and today we are going to start the side deck analysis videos with the most popular and dominant deck in the meta, Chaos Turbo. The most recent event to take place in the tournament scene was PWCQ 30. This event had 50 participants, and the top 8 cut was 5 Turbo decks and 3 Warrior decks. Shoutouts to John Wick for their undefeated run with this deck. Just looking at it, the word solid comes to mind. This deck looks like it's prepared to take on just about anything, and the 7-0 result backs that up. The first thing that jumps out at me in the side deck is Jinzo. This seems like it has the potential to be a stronger choice in the current environment than its most obvious comparable card, Mobius the Frost Monarch. While Mobius addresses a few issues that Jinzo can't, something like Level Limit Area B or Swords of Revealing Light for example, Jinzo still has a lot going for it, and given the absence of burn from yet another premier level top 8, perhaps something like Level Limit or similar Floodgate cards weren't considered to be major threats for this event. It's true that if Jinzo is freezing traps and then Jinzo leaves play, the traps are live again, whereas Mobius can just destroy the cards, but it's important to remember that many of the trap cards being played right now in the top decks are chainable, so Jinzo is more likely to actually disrupt your opponent's plans, at least in the short term. Another obvious but important thing to keep in mind is that Jinzo is dark, and Mobius is water. In a deck with 3 Chaos monsters, this can be an important difference. One final thing to note with Jinzo, it has 1500 defense, where Mobius only has 1000. This means that Tsukiyomi alone can't get Jinzo off the table for good. It would have to be paired with Nobleman of Crossout, or an already set trap card like Regeki Break, that the opponent could use to deal with the Jinzo once it was face down. The next thing I want to discuss with this list is the 1-1 spread with Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, where one is main decked and an extra copy is side decked. I think this is a strong distribution for the current meta. Kaiku is very strong against turbo decks, above average against control decks, but certainly not the hero card, but it's fairly weak against warrior decks, which tend to be a difficult matchup for turbo. By splitting the pair of Kaikus this way, it gives you the chance to find one in the mirror in game 1, but doesn't run the risk of drawing too many against your bad matchup. The triple Sakuretsu Armor side deck is fairly standard for turbo at this point, and we see it here again. It's really good against both the warrior deck and the earth aggro deck, but in other matchups it's not as reliable. It's not a dead card in the mirror or against control, but it is more dependent on specific situations where decks that aren't looking to beat down every turn may not create those situations on a reliable basis. For that reason, we see them in the side, and I think that's good given the current field. Also on the same note, 2 copies of Berserk Gorilla in the side deck. This may seem counterintuitive to the point I made earlier about Jinzo being dark and Mobius being water, but I think that the turbo deck gets more benefit from using Berserk Gorilla as the anti-beatdown monster of choice than it would from using something like Zombira the Dark, in spite of the more favorable attribute. The reason for this is that Berserk Gorilla is simply more flexible. Against a combo deck like Reasoning Gate, you want more things that can help you push damage quickly, because giving the opponent too many draw phases can certainly be a liability. Since Zombira can't attack directly, it doesn't fill this role as well. While Zombira is probably a little stronger against warriors or something like Gravekeeper's Spy, this deck has more ways around defensive walls than most with the multiple Chaos monsters, so that should be a lesser consideration. Swords of Revealing Light is another card that has been picking up steam. The biggest drawback to Turbo in my mind is how monster heavy the deck is. Sometimes you just need more time to get rolling, and Swords is a good way to achieve that. If something like Mystic Swordsman level 2 is constantly pressuring your flip effect monsters, then it's going to be difficult for you to pull ahead in that match. Swords is a good way to give yourself more time and more chances to draw cards and find those boss chaos monsters. Mind Control at 2 seems pretty standard these days. I've seen lists that play 3, but I think 2 is where you want to be right now. While Mind Control and Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer tend to be the strongest counters to Turbo, Mind Control is a prime example of too much of a good thing sometimes. And players are getting better about checking for this in the same way they would check for Nobleman of Crossout. Nothing feels worse than using Mind Control and seeing that you just got a Sangin. Not much to say on this. It's a good card, but 2 feels like the right number in this meta. Speaking of too much of a good thing, let's talk about the 1-1 split on Trap Dust Shoot. This card is obviously strong when you get it early, but how often have you played this card and drawn it very late in the game and wished it was anything else? For that reason, I've started to notice the number of main deck Dust Shoots going back down a little bit, and the number of top cut decks opting to have a full set between the main and side deck is slightly declining as well. Don't get me wrong, you do still see triple Dust Shoot main decks, and this card is very strong and polarizing when you get it early, but I am seeing more and more players do what John Wick did here and split the Dust Shoots between the main and the side. Another selling point for this, in addition to it being a bad draw in the late game, is that Trap Dust Shoot is fairly weak against the Warrior deck, which we have already established as a tough matchup for Turbo. So just like what I said about the 1-1 split with Kaiku, the same reasoning can be applied to Dust Shoot, and the extra copy in the side can come in for the mirror match. The single copy of Asura Priest is good, but not really surprising. It's a decently statted light monster that can be good at cleaning up scapegoat walls in the control or reasoning matchups. Not much to say about this, just a strong choice. Double Mystic Walk reigns supreme again. If you saw my previous video about Burn's current place in the meta, then you know that a pretty recent trend has been a combination of single Mobius, double walk for that matchup. This deck has something similar with the Genzo and double walk. Pretty standard to see 2 walks at this point though. And finally, the Solemn Judgment. A single Solemn in the side with none in the main deck isn't really something I've seen done too often, but I do like it, as it's a flex slot essentially. It's the kind of card you can use to stop a big play from the opponent or to protect a push you are making. The life point cost can be steep, but it makes up for it in versatility. That being said, I'm not really sure which matchups this would have been intended for. My gut tells me it's for the Giant Trunade decks and the combo decks, and maybe something else that can come in against Warriors to try and cement a board state once you get a lead. Since Warriors also use Solemn Judgment, the most common counter to Solemn is another Solemn. Let me know in the comments what you think about the 1-of Solemn in the side. We talked about a couple of alternatives while analyzing the list, but before I end the video, I want to mention some other cards that we see from time to time in the side deck of Turbo and some general thoughts on those. King Tiger Wanku comes to mind as a possible alternative. It's strong against things like Scapegoat or battle searchers like Mystic Tomato, but I tend to find it to be a little clunky in the Turbo deck. Something like Asura Priest works better in my opinion. Again, the biggest downside to Turbo is how monster heavy the deck can be. If you're going to side additional monsters in, it helps to try to keep light and dark attributes as a focus when you can. One of the more puzzling things that John Wick's side deck was missing, however, was an extra copy of Book of Moon. I find Book to be really strong against Thousand Eyes Restrict decks, or decks playing Royal Decree. However, since this particular list didn't play that many traps, it isn't nearly as vulnerable to Royal Decree as a Turbo list playing extra copies of Jar of Greed, Trap Dust Shoot, or Solemn Judgment would be. Kinetic Soldier, aka Cypher Soldier, is another card we see fairly often, but I think that's better in the Warrior deck for the Warrior Mirror match, since that deck is looking to push big chunks of damage, where Turbo tends to play for the board state and then sneak in a big burst of damage with Chaos Summons when possible. For that reason, I still think Berserk Gorilla is the stronger choice. Lightning Vortex has been picking up some steam, and while Turbo can mitigate the discard cost better than most decks, I still think Asura Priest is a stronger choice. It's true that Vortex has a higher ceiling, as it's basically a smashing ground on steroids, but its basic capabilities are more narrow, whereas Asura Priest can also push damage across. One of the more interesting options I've been seeing recently is Legendary Jujutsu Master. However, I think that's much stronger if you opt to play Phoenix Wingwind Blast over Raigeki Break. For the Break version, I still think Gorilla and Sakuretsu are the way to go for your tech against the aggro decks. For the Burn matchup, we sometimes see Turbo siding something like Hysteric Fairy to clear Ojama tokens. While this isn't necessarily a bad call, I don't think the deck really needs it. Mystic Walk is still more effective, and it's a spell card, which once again deals with the issue of having too many monsters in the deck. I think John Wick was right to omit a Hysteric Fairy type effect. Turbo usually doesn't need something like that effect to deal with the tokens, especially if you stick with walks. And finally, Dust Tornado. You can play it, or you can not play it. It works basically in every version of Turbo, and has applications against several of the other decks, but whether or not you play it really just depends on your list and what you're expecting the meta to be. The top 8 of this particular event was 5 Chaos Turbo and 3 Warrior decks. While Dust Tornado can be good against warriors, I wouldn't say it's required. This is one where it really depends on the player and the individual day. With the representation of Burn and Royal Decree at an all-time low, my gut tells me that the lack of Dust Tornado was a meta call for this particular case, and it seems to have worked out. Before we wrap up, I would say this is a really strong deck for anyone looking for a turbo list. I would recommend starting with this one and then maybe tweaking it for your playstyle. The list seems strong as is and doesn't really require any changes beyond what you would do leading up to a tournament for whatever you anticipate the meta to be. So this could be a really good list for a newer turbo player to start with. Let me know in the comments what you think about this deck, your thoughts on the side deck options for turbo, all the different things it has available to it, and if you like this video format. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, duel well and duel often.